My name is Abigail. I'm 24 years old. And while my brother was handed tuition, a new car, and the keys to a downtown condo, I worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on in a 1-bedroom apartment with a broken heater. My parents called it teaching me independence. They called his life an investment. I called mine survival. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? The diner smelled of stale coffee and industrial bleach, a fitting perfume for the graveyard shift. It was 2 a.m. when my estranged uncle, Patrick, slid into the booth at my section. He did not ask for a menu. Instead, he slid a thick manila folder across the sticky laminate table. He looked at me with a grim expression and told me my parents, Richard and Patricia, were meeting with a judge the following afternoon. Their goal was simple. They planned to officially declare me mentally unfit. They were filing for a permanent legal conservatorship over my estate, an estate I did not even know existed. I did not gasp. I did not cry. I did not ask why my own parents would attempt to strip away my basic human autonomy. I just nodded, took my 15-minute break, opened my laptop in the staff room, and started clicking cancel. I froze my meager personal checking account. I changed every password, enabled 2-factor authentication on every digital footprint I owned, and secured a meeting with Patrick's legal team for 9 o'clock the next morning. My anger was not loud, it was entirely clinical. People often wonder how someone can endure systematic abuse without fighting back sooner. The answer is the invisible chain of the survivor. It is a psychological condition called learned helplessness. When you are emotionally starved from birth, you are conditioned to view neglect as a normal baseline. You learn to accept breadcrumbs of basic tolerance and call it love. My parents had spent 2 decades training me to translate their cruelty into my own character development. I remembered the exact afternoon my acceptance letter for a highly prestigious architectural scholarship arrived in the mail. I was 18. I had polished the envelope with my sleeve. My father, Richard, took the letter from my hands, glanced at the crest, and dropped it directly into the kitchen trash can. He told me I needed to learn how the real world worked. He said architecture was a vanity project for people with safety nets, and I was not one of them. The very next morning, Richard and Patricia wrote a massive check to fully fund my older brother Cameron's fictional app development firm. I did not scream or protest. I simply picked up an extra shift at a hotel reception desk. They had successfully programmed me to believe that my exhaustion was the rent I had to pay just to exist in their orbit. I had been the silent investor in their version of a family. Love was merely a subscription service, and I was the one footing the bill while receiving absolutely zero benefits. But, standing in that dingy diner break room, staring at the digital confirmation of my locked accounts, that invisible chain snapped completely. I rubbed my exhausted eyes, trying to summon even a fraction of regret or familial loyalty, but there was only razor-sharp clarity. I was no longer the tragic victim of their narrative. I was a survivor, shifting into a predator. The emotional tether was permanently severed. This was no longer a family dispute. It was an accounting error, and I was preparing to balance the ledger. The next morning, I arrived at the architectural design firm, where I interned. The transition from diner uniform to drafting clothes was my daily routine, but today, the stakes were entirely different. Before I could even log into my workstation, the front desk receptionist called my extension. My father was in the lobby. He did not wait to be invited back. Richard pushed past the glass doors and marched directly into the open-plan studio. His face was a mask of manufactured concern, but his eyes were entirely cold. He bypassed me completely and walked straight to my senior manager's desk. In a voice loud enough for the entire floor to hear, Richard announced that I was experiencing a severe psychological episode. He claimed I had been acting erratically, suffering from delusions, and posing a risk to myself and others. He handed my manager a fabricated medical assessment and suggested that the firm terminate my internship immediately for liability reasons. He was trying to destroy my professional reputation to manufacture evidence for his conservatorship petition. He needed a paper trail of instability, and he was perfectly willing to burn my career to the ground to get it. I did not rush forward to defend myself. I did not engage in a screaming match. Doing so would only validate his performance. Instead, I calmly picked up my desk phone, dialed building security, and requested that an aggressive trespasser be escorted from the premises. I stood in total silence as two uniformed guards arrived and physically directed my father toward the elevator. He glared at me, his mask slipping for just a fraction of a second, revealing the pure venom underneath. He had expected me to crumble. He was shocked that I simply stopped playing along. 10 minutes later, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text message from my mother, Patricia. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She wrote that she loved me deeply, that the family was incredibly worried about my mental decline, and that she needed me to sign a durable power of attorney immediately. She claimed it was just a temporary measure to protect me from myself. There was absolutely no remorse in her words. There was only a desperate, calculating attempt to secure legal control over my signature. If I signed that document, they would have the unilateral authority to manage my health, my autonomy, and my finances. They were doubling down on their toxicity, assuming my lifelong conditioning would force me to comply. They thought my silence was their safest asset. They viewed my lifelong obedience as a guarantee of their success. But every vicious text message Patricia sent, and every public scene Richard caused, only served to greenlight my impending retaliation. They were systematically eliminating any microscopic trace of empathy I might have had left for them. I did not reply to Patricia's messages. I simply took screenshots of every single threat, timestamped them, and forwarded the entire digital trail directly to Patrick's legal team. My family had just provided me with documented proof of harassment and attempted extortion. I rubbed my temples, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over me. The escalation proved they were terrified. They were tightening the noose, entirely unaware that it was already wrapped around their own necks. By 9 o'clock that same morning, I was sitting inside a sterile, glass-walled conference room at a premier downtown law firm. The shift from emotional survival to professional warfare was absolute. Across the long mahogany table sat my Uncle Patrick, 2 senior trust litigation attorneys, and a team of forensic auditors. The air in the room was heavy with the smell of fresh coffee and impending ruin. Patrick quietly explained that his team had suspected the embezzlement for over 8 months. They had already conducted a shadow audit and built the entire case behind the scenes. They were simply waiting for the right moment, and my signature, to drop the hammer. The lead attorney opened a thick leather binder and slid a certified document toward me. It was the last will and testament of my late grandfather, Arthur. I read the pages in total silence. According to the legal parameters of the document, I was the sole beneficiary of the Sterling Heritage Properties Trust. It was a multi-state commercial real estate and luxury resort empire. My grandfather had explicitly chosen me because he recognized my work ethic. He had deliberately excluded my parents and my brother Cameron, fearing they would squander the legacy on their own vanity. The trust was legally structured to transfer full voting control and financial access directly to me upon my 25th birthday. I am 24 now. After the original independent trustee passed away, Richard and Patricia had aggressively petitioned the court to install themselves as interim trustees, draining the accounts in secret. Knowing their access was about to expire in a matter of months, they fabricated this medical crisis. The conservatorship was their desperate, final play to maintain permanent control over my empire. The lead forensic auditor then projected a massive spreadsheet onto the conference room monitor. It was a detailed tracking of every single distribution made from my trust over the past 6 years. The numbers were staggering. More than $850,000 had been illegally siphoned from my accounts. The withdrawals were meticulously disguised under vague descriptions like beneficiary housing, educational support, and professional development. But the audit revealed the undeniable truth. The housing payments were actually funding Cameron's luxury downtown penthouse. The educational support covered the monthly lease on his brand new sports car. The professional development funds were wired directly into his bank account to subsidize his extravagant vacations and designer wardrobe. My parents had literally stolen my future to finance their golden child's lavish lifestyle. While I was working overnight shifts at a diner and counting pennies for bus fare, my brother was living like a millionaire on money that legally belonged to me. My parents had watched me struggle to survive, praised my exhaustion as character building, and actively drained my empire. The attorney handed me a pen and a stack of emergency court petitions. The documents would authorize a total suspension of my parents' proxy rights, place an immediate freeze on all disputed accounts, and initiate a massive civil lawsuit for breach of fiduciary duty. I did not hesitate for a single second. I did not think about family holidays or childhood memories. I viewed my parents purely as hostile corporate entities that had breached a contract. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my actual signature on every single line. The ink felt like a weapon. I authorized the legal strike without a single drop of mercy. The battle had officially moved from the dining room table to the courtroom floor. They thought I was weak because I had endured their abuse in silence. But endurance is a form of training. They had inadvertently built me into the exact kind of ruthless architect required to dismantle them. Just when the scope of their betrayal seemed to reach its absolute limit, the lead auditor handed me a secondary folder. This was the lethal discovery, a twist that elevated their actions from simple familial theft to a highly sophisticated federal crime. I opened the file and stared at the corporate registration documents for Cameron's technology startup. For years, Richard and Patricia had celebrated Cameron as a brilliant entrepreneur, bragging to anyone who would listen about his innovative app development company. The audit revealed the horrifying reality. The startup had absolutely zero employees. It had zero customers, zero products, and zero actual revenue. It was nothing more than a hollow shell corporation engineered entirely by my father. Richard had utilized the fake company as a legal washing machine to launder my stolen inheritance. The financial records showed that Richard was funneling massive monthly retainers from my trust into the startup, which were then immediately wired into secret offshore retirement accounts controlled exclusively by my parents. Cameron was certainly enjoying the luxury penthouse and the sports car, but Richard and Patricia were the true financial masterminds. They were systematically draining my empire to secure their own wealthy future, leaving me with nothing but exhaustion and debt. People constantly ask how parents can look their own daughter in the eye, watch her suffer in poverty, and steal from her without collapsing under the weight of their own guilt. The answer lies in the trap of cruel normalization. It is a psychological mechanism known as cognitive dissonance. In order to live with their own criminal behavior, Richard and Patricia had to rewrite reality in their own minds. They could not accept that they were thieves, so they convinced themselves that my independence was a justification for their exploitation. They told themselves that because I was resilient, because I could work 2 jobs and survive in a freezing apartment, I simply did not need the money. In their twisted psychological framework, my strength became the excuse for their abuse. They rationalized that Cameron was fragile and deserved the luxury, while I was tough and deserved the struggle. They normalized their cruelty so completely that they viewed their massive embezzlement as a reasonable family decision. This is how abusers sleep soundly at night. They twist the narrative until the victim's suffering becomes proof of the abuser's wisdom. Reading those documents, any lingering shred of familial obligation I held was permanently eradicated. They were not misguided parents trying to do their best. They were calculating, methodical criminals who viewed my existence as nothing more than a funding source for their vanity. There was no path to redemption available to them. There was no apology that could undo the elaborate financial architecture of their betrayal. I closed the folder and looked at the legal team. I instructed them to prepare for total war. I did not just want my money back. I wanted the shell company dismantled, the offshore accounts seized, and my parents stripped of every single asset they had purchased with my stolen blood and sweat. I wanted them to experience the exact brand of survival they had so generously gifted to me. I stood up from the conference table, my posture rigid, my mind operating with the cold precision of a predator closing in on its prey. The final confrontation did not take place in a living room. It happened exactly where it belonged, inside the executive boardroom of Sterling Heritage Properties. My parents had called an emergency meeting of the interim board, completely unaware that their reign had already ended. I stood in the hallway outside the heavy oak doors, flanked by Uncle Patrick and my legal team. Through the glass partition, I could see Richard sitting at the head of the massive mahogany table. He was frantically refreshing his phone screen. Our auditors had discovered that Richard was attempting to execute a $250,000 emergency wire transfer to his offshore account. He knew the walls were closing in, and he was trying to flee with a final payout. I watched as his phone screen flashed a bright red error message. The bank had blocked the transfer. The emergency court freeze was officially active. Richard's face dropped in sheer panic. That was my cue. I pushed open the double doors and walked into the room. The power dynamic flipped in a fraction of a second. Richard stood up, his face turning a violent shade of crimson. Patricia gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in shock. Cameron, who had been sitting in the corner playing on his phone, suddenly looked like a terrified child. They were not shocked by what they had done. They were shocked that I had stopped playing along. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice. I walked directly to the head of the table, occupying the space my grandfather had intended for me. I opened my briefcase and slid the forensic audit, the certified will, and the emergency freeze orders across the polished wood. The documents spread out like a fan of undeniable consequences. Richard attempted to summon his old authority, demanding to know what I thought I was doing. His voice was loud, but it lacked any real power. I informed him that his proxy was suspended, his offshore accounts were frozen, and he was permanently removed as the interim chief executive. Patricia immediately broke down into dramatic, weeping sobs. She reached across the table, begging me to remember that we were a family. She pleaded for mercy, claiming they were losing everything and begging me to think of my brother. I looked at the three of them, the people who had praised my poverty while stealing my millions. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely nothing. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy and suffocating. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table, and delivered the final blow in a tone of pure ice. You tore this family apart when you decided my future was your allowance. Your subscription has been canceled. I turned to the corporate security guards waiting by the door and instructed them to escort the former trustees out of my building. Richard tried to protest, but the guards moved in. I watched them being physically marched out of the boardroom, stripped of their titles, their stolen wealth, and their dignity. I did not look back. I simply took my seat at the head of the table and opened the first file of my new empire. The reckoning was complete. The architect had finally taken her throne. The legal hammer struck with absolute and devastating finality. Over the following months, the artificial empire they had built on my back completely collapsed. Richard and Patricia were formally charged with criminal fraud and embezzlement. Facing total bankruptcy and court-ordered restitution, they were forced to vacate their sprawling estate and move into a tiny, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city. Cameron's luxury penthouse was immediately seized by the bank, and his sports car was repossessed. Without my stolen inheritance to fund his lifestyle, his fake startup dissolved overnight. He was forced to take a minimum wage retail job just to survive the month. They had lost the exact status they had sacrificed my youth to maintain. I took my rightful place as the head of Sterling Heritage Properties. My first act as the controlling shareholder was to establish an ethical architectural scholarship in my grandfather's name. It was specifically designed to fully fund the education of brilliant, hardworking students who lacked a financial safety net. I wanted to ensure that no one else would ever have to watch their dreams thrown into the trash simply because they could not afford the toll. I've come to realize that the most dangerous lie society teaches us is the myth of unconditional blood loyalty. We are heavily conditioned to believe that we must forgive our families at all costs, that we must keep the peace, and that demanding accountability is somehow cruel or vindictive. But what people often misunderstand about toxic family dynamics is that peace built on extortion is just a hostage situation. Demanding restitution and forcing my abusers into the exact poverty they designed for me was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of necessary moral equilibrium. For anyone listening to this who has ever been the scapegoat, the workhorse, or the invisible one in their own family, I need you to hear this uncomfortable truth. Walking away from the people who share your DNA is not a tragedy. It is an act of profound self-love. Being needed by your abusers is a weapon they use to keep you compliant, not a manifestation of genuine affection. They do not love you. They love the convenience of your silence and the depth of your sacrifice. You do not owe your future to the people who actively dismantle it. True healing does not always look like holding hands and finding a middle ground. Sometimes, the most profound liberation is found in the absolute, permanent severing of toxic ties. You have the right to stop saving the people who exploit you. You have the right to look your abusers in the eye and let them face the exact consequences they created. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. But my forgiveness looks like distance, not reconciliation. My peace was not found in chaotic revenge, but in the cold, unyielding boundaries of the truth. I am no longer a victim paying for someone else's luxury. I am the architect of my own consequences, and the foundation I have built is finally unbreakable. If you've ever had to build your own ground when your family let you fall, share this story. Drop a comment below if you've ever had to cut toxic ties to save yourself. We see you, and your peace is worth it.